Thank you, Mr. President. Members of the Court, good afternoon again. I will respond to Myanmar's attempt to persuade you that in attacking Rohingya civilians indiscriminately, engaging in mass murder, killing children and infants, raping and gang raping women and girls, burning homes and villages, and shooting and killing fleeing refugees, the Tatmadaw were engaging in authentic counterterrorism operations. There is no counterterrorism justification for the sickening genocidal acts committed during Myanmar's clearance operations. This conclusion is confirmed by the convincing testimony of the victim witnesses from the three main villages who fully corroborate the findings of the UN FFM. And that conclusion is also supported by the authoritative and conclusive expert testimony provided by Professor Michael Newton. I will respond to Myanmar's arguments and the questions from judges in relation to ARSA's capabilities and why Myanmar's clearance operations were not authentic counterterrorism exercises. I will then comment upon Myanmar's unreliable evidence. Before I do so, I raise 2 points. First, as my colleagues have mentioned, Mr. Staker has conceded that genocide can be committed during counterterrorism operations. That means that counterterrorism is mere context and not a viable alternative intent to genocide. Second, throughout the entirety of Myanmar's first round, not a single mention was made of the Arakan Army or any other ethnic armed organization. Not a single mention. That is quite remarkable and revealing, especially after the comparison I drew in the first round between the acts committed against the Rohingya community in purported reaction to ARSA and the treatment of the Rakhine and other ethnic communities in the context of the Tatmadaw's ongoing conflict against the Arakan Army and other ethnic armed organizations. Recall that the rules of engagement for ARSA and the Arakan Army are the exact same. Myanmar has provided no explanation for the difference in treatment of the Rohingya and Rakhine communities. The only reasonable explanation for the differential treatment is Myanmar's genocidal intent for the Rohingya. Now, turning to ARSA and its capabilities. Judge Brandt, also on behalf of Judge Charlesworth and Judge Cleveland, asked for the parties' characterizations of ARSA's representativeness within the civilian population, its strength, estimated size, organization, and hierarchical structure, and military and weapons capabilities. On this matter, the Gambia relies primarily on the reporting of the UN FFM and the IIMM, both of which provide independent and objective information on the capabilities of ARSA that included official information released publicly by Myanmar. Paragraphs 1009 to 1067 of the 2018 detailed FFM report are particularly helpful on this question. Regarding ARSA's representativeness and estimated size, the FFM reported that, quote, total numbers of members and supporters are difficult to ascertain. The actual membership seems to have been small, but the support base was certainly in the hundreds. This includes the last-minute mobilization of many Rohingya, with many of those who participated in the 25 August 2017 attacks mobilized only shortly before that day or on the day itself. However, overall membership and support for ARSA represented a minority of the total population, end quote. According to the FFM, quote, supporters claim to be motivated by the need to fight long-standing discrimination against the Rohingya and the denial of human rights. Some had personally suffered oppression and abuse by the Tatmadaw or other security forces, end quote. In any event, Myanmar's rules of engagement are still fully applicable, regardless of ARSA's size, as confirmed by the testimony of Professor Newton. Regarding ARSA's strength and military and weapons capabilities, the UN FFM reported that, quote, ARSA is commonly regarded as a poorly armed and poorly trained group, with a small number of partly trained members, but principally relying on untrained villagers to conduct attacks with sticks and knives. In comparison with the long-standing and well-armed non-state armed groups active in northern Myanmar, ARSA's level of organization and military capacity appears more limited, end quote. In terms of training, the FFM reported that, quote, a core group of ARSA members received some military training, including in weaponry. Some who had received weapons training then replicated it for others, although often without weapons, by using hand gestures and wooden models, end quote. Those who were, quote, mobilized shortly prior to the 2017 attacks had no training and little information about the group, end quote. As to weaponry, the FFM reports, quote, for the 2017 attacks, most ARSA members were without firearms, but equipped with homemade weapons such as sticks, knives, swords, and slingshots, and some homemade explosives. One ARSA member told the FFM that, quote, all they did was give us a stick and said that we should pretend that it is a weapon. We never got any training or weapons, end quote. The IIMM similarly found that at the time of the August 2017 attacks, ARSA only had a, quote, modest arsenal of around 40 to 70 firearms, end quote. The, quote, majority of ARSA members used bladed weapons, sticks, and a small number of locally produced artisanal firearms, end quote. Imagine how outgunned and outmanned they were by the thousands of heavily armed Tatmadaw who were awaiting them, having been pre-deployed across northern Rakhine State with automated weapons, mortars, and other heavy equipment. Does Myanmar really expect us to believe that ARSA intended to capture and control all of northern Rakhine State? In fact, they were quickly routed by the Tatmadaw and forced to abandon the field in less than 3 days, according to an IIMM witness statement submitted by Myanmar. Counsel for Myanmar mentioned IEDs, or improvised explosive devices, over 10 times in their first round. This is what the FFM found regarding IED use. Quote, ARSA did have some capacity to produce crude IEDs, but that capacity is questionable, both in terms of production and execution. As one ARSA member elaborated, the IEDs were made locally by members and are not particularly strong. We use them just to scare the military. In the attack in which he participated, the explosive was not directed at the checkpoint as intended, and no military casualties were reported. While the Myanmar government's list of ARSA attacks mentions the use of IEDs by ARSA, none of the casualties sustained by the Myanmar security forces were reported as having been caused by an IED, end quote. The FFM also noted that, quote, the government reported that during the 2017 clearance operations, it confiscated 15 assorted arms, 97 ammunitions, and 67 homemade IEDs. These figures demonstrate ARSA's weaponry capacity at the time, in particular when juxtaposed against the military capacity of the Tatmadaw, end quote. As to the nature of ARSA's attacks, the FFM reported that, quote, Arsa was able to carry out multiple coordinated attacks in a highly controlled and militarized environment, but with little military capability. The attacks employed hit-and-run tactics with predominantly untrained civilians, mostly wielding sticks and knives. The Arsa attacks caused minimal Tatmadaw casualties compared to their own losses, end quote. An Arsa participant in the 2017 attacks told the FFM of those attacks, quote, "It was not really like a military attack by us. It was a protest or uprising, claiming our rights," end quote. Regarding Arsa's organization, the FFM reported that, quote, "In its early stages, the organization did not have a name or clearly defined goals. It was loosely organized around the principle of seeking justice for the Rohingya Muslim community," end quote. Arsa's forces are organized hierarchically under a commander-in-chief, who is currently under arrest pending prosecution in Bangladesh. Myanmar did not even declare Arsa a terrorist organization until 25 August 2017, which gives an indication of its own assessment of its capabilities up to that point. Both Mr. Blom-Cooper and Ms. Lowry stated that Arsa's objective was to, quote, obtain, quote, "complete control over northern Rakhine State," end quote. Their citation to Myanmar's counter-memorial does not support such a claim. Curiously, they also cited to the FFM report. The paragraphs that they cited in that report also do not support their claim. And the very next paragraph in the FFM report directly disputes their position. According to the UNFFM, quote, "While high-level Myanmar officials imply that Arsa seeks an independent state, homeland, or caliphate, the mission has not seen such statements from Arsa," end quote. Ms. Lowry stressed Arsa's use of WhatsApp to coordinate activities as a sign of its sophistication. Frankly, that just shows the opposite. Arsa, by the way, also had a Twitter account that it opened in March 2017, which is controlled by a political group made up of 5 people living outside of Myanmar. Both Ms. Lowry and Mr. Blom-Cooper cited a call by Arsa's leader to burn down villages as part of the attacks. And both of them ignored the evidence that the Gambia cited to show that the call was not heeded. Recall that according to Myanmar's own source, Amnesty International, quote, "While Amnesty International has confirmed that some Rohingya villagers participated in Arsa attacks, the overwhelming majority of Rohingya did not. Even in the specific villages where attacks occurred, there is no question that most villagers did not take part in Arsa attacks," end quote. Similarly, the International Crisis Group concluded that the Arsa commander's call to burn down Rakhine Buddhist villages, quote, "does not appear to have been widely acted upon, as only 3 non-Rohingya villages are known to have been attacked or burned down by Rohingya," end quote. The fact that this call was not heeded shows the lack of support for Arsa among the Rohingya. The fact that 2 counsel for Myanmar ignored this reality shows the extent they are willing to go to concoct a sham defense for their client. Evidence placed into the record by Myanmar after the close of the written pleadings shows that Myanmar closely surveilled Arsa, knew about many of its members, and yet did not take action to dismantle the organization. According to the testimony of IIMM witness P4715, quote, "It was well known that the authorities were surveilling Arsa and knew about its members. They found out about Arsa members from informants. Although the authorities received information about Arsa from informants, they never tried to dismantle Arsa. This has always puzzled me. I believe they allowed Arsa to exist because what they really wanted was to attack our villages and empty them. All of these factors combined have led me to believe that Myanmar government allowed ARSA to exist as a justification to keep persecuting us until we were gone." End quote. This is from Myanmar's own evidence. It was Myanmar that put this witness statement into the record, and they have to live with it. It is also noteworthy that Myanmar passed in silence on the undisputed evidence cited in the first round regarding the Tatmadaws' recent collaboration with ARSA to fight the Arakan army. Myanmar's efforts to trump up the threat posed by ARSA is undermined by its own manipulation of and collaboration with them. By all measures, ARSA was not of the same caliber of organization as the Arakan army or other ethnic armed groups in Myanmar. It was a fledgling group, never a match for the Tatmadaw, more of a pawn, and was used as the pretext for Myanmar's genocidal clearance operations. Regarding the second and the last parts of Judge Brandt's question, I note that the FFM reported on Myanmar's public accounting of its own and ARSA's casualties from the 2017 clearance operations. According to the Myanmar government's own reporting in November 2017, quote, 376 ARSA Bengali terrorists killed, 131 ethnic Hindu Bengali people, and 13 members of security force killed. And according to Ms. Lowry, quote, in terms of casualties from the 2016 attacks, the government estimated at the time that 69 ARSA terrorists, 7 Tatmadaw soldiers, and 10 police officers were killed. End quote. I move now to the clearance operations and why the evidence elicited at these hearings confirms the FFM's conclusion that they were not legitimate counterterrorism operations. First, Myanmar has not shown that it made even the slightest effort to distinguish between alleged ARSA terrorists and Rohingya civilians. Ms. Lowry asserted without evidence that Myanmar's references to supporters was to, quote, local villagers who, though not formal ARSA members, joined in ARSA's violence when called to do so. Active adult participants, she asserted. But how does she explain the killings in Tulatoli that witness MS testified about? How does she explain the burning to death of witness NJ's infant in Chutpien, or the gang rape that she endured? How does she explain the execution of over 80 men and boys in Maungnu, as testified by witness MN, the sole survivor? How does she explain the evidence from Amnesty International and the International Crisis Group and the UNFFM that all civilians were targeted without distinction and that very few Rohingya answered the call of ARSA's leader? Perhaps the court will hear more assertions without evidence on Wednesday and Thursday, but there is certainly no evidence that the Tatmadaw made any effort to distinguish between civilians and ARSA as called for by Myanmar's rules of engagement. To the contrary, they purposefully directed their attacks and atrocities against all Rohingya. Regarding Myanmar's position that ARSA supporters comprise men, women, and children, Ms. Lowry asserts that children means youth in the rank and file of those confronting the military. Again, no evidence. Mr. Lowenstein has just fully addressed this point. Second, Myanmar has not shown that it provided protection to Rohingya civilians. Ms. Lowry excuses Myanmar's inciting and arming of ethnic Rakhine and encouraging them to join in the Tatmadaw's attack on the Rohingya population as a, quote, initiative to recruit non-Bengali citizens to a new regional force, end quote. Incredible. Why didn't they recruit Rohingya into such a localized police force? Why were the Rohingya excluded? The answer is obvious. They were always the target for those new militias. That was shown clearly in the video of the Tatmadaw soldier explaining the clearance operations to ethnic Rakhine, calling on them to arm themselves with swords to bravely face the, quote, animal Rohingya. Judge Pillay asked if counsel for Myanmar could provide examples of how, when, and where the Myanmar military protected the people. I will take the liberty of sharing the Gambia's answer. They attacked the Rohingya people, the exact opposite of protecting them. If some Tatmadaw units ignored some Rohingya as they fled the killing and the burning of their villages, they were the exception rather than the rule. You would have to believe the Tatmadaw's self-serving and unreliable daily operation reports and letters to find any claims that the clearance operations were undertaken to protect, quote, ethnic residents or to rescue the, quote, local ethnics / local natives in danger. Of course, the Rohingya were never considered as local ethnics, and there is no reason to believe the Tatmadaw's propaganda in any event. Third, Myanmar has not shown that it adhered to its own rules of engagement. Professor Michael Newton provided authoritative testimony last Thursday as to why he concluded that Myanmar acted with genocidal intent, based on Myanmar not following its own rules of engagement. I won't read all of his testimony back to the court, as I'm sure the court recalls it very clearly. But he said specifically, as part of this quote on your screen, I learned in the counter memorial that there were rules of engagement. They were not only not followed, they were completely ignored, which is the substantive basis for those statements, end quote. Myanmar also asserts that its clearance operations were conducted only in places where ARSA was active. The insinuation is that the operations were in hot pursuit immediately after ARSA attacks, following the ARSA attackers. But that is not at all how they played out. As explained by the UN FFM, quote, the security forces' response was immediate, within hours, brutal and grossly disproportionate. Ostensibly to eliminate the terrorist threat posed by ARSA, in the days and weeks that followed, it encompassed hundreds of villages across Mongdaw, Buthidaw, and Rathadong townships. The operations targeted and terrorized the entire Rohingya population. The authorities called them clearance operations. They continued for more than 2 months and for a considerable period after the government claimed their completion on 5 September 2017. During the course of the operation, more than 40% of all villages in northern Rakhine State were partially or totally destroyed. The most intense phase was the first 3 weeks, when more than 80% of the destruction was perpetrated, end quote. In the first round, I showed you reply figure 1.2, which shows that Myanmar wholly or partially destroyed at least 188 out of 329 villages where, according to Myanmar, there was no ARSA presence and so no pretense of clearance operations. Myanmar gave no response to that. It is evident that the clearance operations were not limited to areas of actual ARSA activity, but targeted the Rohingya all across northern Rakhine State. As Professor Newton testified, what happened during the clearance operations was not occasional lapses in soldiers following the rules of engagement. It was a wholesale disregard, a completely different intent and plan, a genocidal plan. This was the same conclusion reached by the Public International Law and Policy Group, which concluded, quote, the investigators also highlighted the likelihood that the military operation could not have been merely a response to the ARSA attacks, debunking the military's narrative of a legitimate counterinsurgency response. The scale, timing, and consistency of the attacks across such a large territory could not have been planned and coordinated in such a short period of time within a few days of the last ARSA attack. The pretense of a clearing operation to protect the state from a Rohingya terrorist insurgency threat rings hollow in the face of so much of this data, end quote. I come now to my last topic, which is Myanmar's evidence. Myanmar did not produce any military officers or experts for oral examination. They initially included a few of them on their witness list, but then withdrew their names before these hearings. Most of Myanmar's factual claims regarding the clearance operations are based primarily, or sometimes solely, on Myanmar's own military reports or testimony from officers or testimony of individuals taken by the military. These sources of evidence are not reliable or independent. The Myanmar military's overriding interest to protect itself taints the credibility of these sources of evidence. As Professor Newton testified, this is true of other militaries across the world. Military reports are, in his words, absolutely unreliable. There is testimony in the record of Myanmar military reports being fabricated, to which Myanmar has not responded. The IIMM screening note for P5513 details such a fabricated report. In fact, Myanmar has not responded to several fabrications of evidence by the Tatmadaw. There were the fabrications of images seeking to depict Rohingya as aggressors and illegal immigrant invaders in the Tatmadaw's post-clearance operations publication. There is the fabrication of images purporting to depict Rohingya burning their own villages, which was in fact members of the Hindu community, as Mr. Lowenstein just discussed. First-hand testimony confirming this has been provided by BBC journalist Jonathan Head. In his affidavit, he also recollects how, during a government-approved trip to Mongdao after the clearance operations, the military forced an individual from the Hindu community to falsely report that Muslims, rather than the military, had attacked their village. Which brings us now to witness M1 and the Ka Maung Sek incident, the primary example on which Myanmar relies as an example of attacks by ARSA requiring a substantive counterterrorism response. You heard from witness M1 on Friday that around 99 Hindu villagers from 2 adjacent villages were killed there on 25 August 2017. Her statement was not obtained by an independent source, but by Myanmar itself. It is unclear to the Gambia whether witness M1 actually appears in the video that Myanmar played twice last Friday. In response to questions from the President, counsel for Myanmar was unable to specifically identify witness M1 in the video or in the transcript. Today, by letter from Myanmar's agent, we learned that witness M1 did not speak in the video, even though her affidavit seemed to indicate that she did. It is notable that the first accounts of this tragic incident that survivors gave were that the military and/or ethnic Rakhine had attacked the village, a village which, the witness said, was predominantly Rohingya. It was the Myanmar authorities who first attributed the attack to ARSA, announcing so in early September 2017. They then repatriated from Bangladesh the Hindu survivors back to Myanmar, including witness M1, housed them at a Tatmadaw military base, and publicized the accounts that the survivors then gave, that it was ARSA terrorists who were responsible for the attack. Given Myanmar's history of using the Hindu community in Rakhine State to support the military's false narratives, due caution is warranted with regards to witness M1. In these circumstances, it is not surprising that the UNFFM considered itself unable to draw any conclusions about what happened at Ka Maung Sek. In its 2018 detailed report, it said, quote, "The mission interviewed 7 Hindus from Ka Maung Sek and nearby villages who witnessed these events or were victims of abuses in September 2017. The mission has verified that a large number of Hindu victims were killed on 25 August 2017 in Kamang Sek. However, the information received was contradictory, including regarding the language spoken by the perpetrators, which, according to the accounts taken, was a key identifying feature since the perpetrators reportedly had their faces covered. The mission's information is insufficient to make any determinations on reasonable grounds regarding the identity of the perpetrators." End quote. In the end, even if ARSA were responsible for this massacre, this would have no bearing on the Gambia's case. The perpetrators of the Kamang Sek massacre should be brought to justice, just as Myanmar itself must be held accountable for its genocide of the Rohingya. In conclusion, Myanmar's clearance operations violated all of the fundamental tenets of legitimate counterterrorism operations, including Myanmar's own. They were not authentic counterterrorism operations. The ARSA attacks were, in fact, a pretext for Myanmar's genocidal attacks on the Rohingya. Mr. President, members of the court, thank you for your kind attention. Mr. President, I request that you call Professor Darjan to the podium to conclude the Gambia's presentations for today.